Ah, vintage gaming and computer gaming alike. New crazes that seem to have struck the internet with all the annoyance of those charming fidget spinners everyone seems to have these days. But seriously, I'm kind of getting into it myself. I love these old games like Chuck Yeager's Air Combat. The only trouble is they won't work on modern hardware. Unless, of course, one is to utilize something like emulation, which never gets quite the same result. And so here you see me trying to repair an old blue and white MacBook
Okay, now
Pro tower.
initialize. Let's see what the deal is here. Initialize. Will it work? Sure, what's going on with this piece of junk?
And here you see me failing to repair said computer.
In the words of 65 Scribe, damn!
To be fair, I really can't blame the hardware involved here. It's 30 plus years old in some cases. But I think I've found a unique way of getting around the headache. Simply use hardware that isn't quite so old. This is a G4 Mac Mini. Now, I'm sure to at least some of you watching this stream, the fact that I'm even mentioning the G4 Mac Mini is a shock. But the fact of the matter is this particular unit has one very critical advantage, and that is that it is a PowerPC chip, and therefore will accept and or can be hacked to accept the old OS 9.2.2. For those of you who are lost, the translation is, because this unit can run that older OS and or can be hacked to do so, means it will run the older software, which can be tricky to get running on Windows DOS-based PCs, but is much easier to deal with on the Macintosh. Another advantage the G4 Mac Mini has in this application is, even though it was considered slow for its time, it's still considered very much a souped-up hot rod, if you will, when being utilized with OSs like 9.22 and software from that era, given its 32GB graphics card, as well as its plus 1 GHz speeds. To build one of these G4 Mac Minis of your own, you'll need the following supplies. The first, of course, is a G4 Mac Mini. Be very careful here, as you cannot use an Intel version of the Mac Mini, as it will not work with that unit. An easy way of distinguishing the two is that the G4, as we see here, has two USB ports and a FireWire port, as well as the usual DVI connection. Any more USB ports and or a different type display connection on the back, and you have the wrong model, and it will not work. You have been warned. My particular model is a model with a 1.33 GHz G4 processor, which I purchased on eBay for just under $100 as, quote, untested. Speaking of untested, I strongly recommend testing your Mac Mini, so if there are problems, you can get your money back. You have been warned. I'm going to use a comprehensive screwdriver set to do this project, but that's really not necessary. You only need a few screwdrivers to get this thing apart. Specifically, a T8 Torx head screwdriver, as well as a very sharp point Phillips head. But I also recommend keeping a T8 as well as a 7 handy, just in case. You'll also need a skinny shafted Phillips head screwdriver to access certain narrow screws. You'll see in a little bit what I'm talking about. As for parts, we're going to need 1 GB of RAM. This is not necessarily required, but I'm choosing to do it because I'm going to be in there anyway, as well as an SSD to upgrade from the old spinning rust hard drive. Again, not necessarily required, but we have to remember how old this drive is. And remember, one of these drives can let go at any time, and changing it can be a pain later on, so might as well get it over with, is my logic. Please note, if you're going to install an SSD in your G4 Mac Mini, you will need to have the PATA or a TAPI interface, that is the pinned interface. The modern SATA interface from modern SSDs will not work on this particular computer. My particular SSD is in fact a kit that converts an mSATA drive to a PATA interface type drive, so it can slip right in place of the stock hard drive. We're also going to need some plastic spongers to help us get the case open, which is very tricky on the Mac Mini. We'll start by turning the unit around and actually approaching it from the I/O shield area. I find 9 out of 10 times that this is the easiest way to gain access. To start, we'll take our sponger and carefully place it in the gap between the fan and the actual top of the case. We'll be using the flat end of the sponger to give us the most leverage. Gently place the sponger between the actual lip of the case and the top of the I/O shield and begin to work it up. Now usually this goes a lot easier, but as we can see with this particular video, I was having a hard time getting this case to cooperate. But after a lot of prying, struggling, choice adjectives, as well as pulled muscles, I finally managed to get the top separated from the actual frame of the unit. Again, the whole trick here is to keep placing the spongers between the two parts of the case and keep prying them apart until they separate. With the case finally open, we can now proceed to the next step, which is removing any antennas we may find inside the actual unit itself. They come apart by simply squeezing the base, which will release the spring, causing them to pop off. Please note that these units came with several different options in terms of antennas and or Bluetooth and or Apple AirPort, for examples. So don't be alarmed if you don't see an antenna in place here. It just means you probably didn't have that option ordered. Just make sure to remove anything you find before you go to the next step, which is removing the motherboard. A strange note on mine is that the antenna is literally simply pulled free. Please note again that Apple made several revisions to this model, so don't be surprised or concerned if you see something different on yours. With the antennas out of the way, we'll now take our skinny shafted Phillips head screwdriver and utilize it to remove the 3 screws that hold the drive assembly to the actual motherboard itself, allowing us to gain access to the hard drive and better access to the RAM. With the screws out of the way, we can simply separate the drive assembly from the motherboard. You may encounter some resistance doing this, and that's because there's an edge/card connector that plugs into the motherboard itself, which links the 2 drives, that is to say the optical drive and the hard drive, with the actual motherboard, and provides the power as well as the data transfer. Just need to move this small piece of Kapton tape which holds a wire right next to the side of the case. Please learn from this YouTuber's mistakes here and be sure to remove those screws using a magnet to ensure that they don't get lost when you pull the 2 separate sections apart. With the 2 halves of the computer, the drive assembly and the motherboard now separated, we can see the fan as well as the hard drive assembly. Note the Apple AirPort Wi-Fi card. You'll need to carefully separate the antenna. Our first step is going to be to get the hard drive out. But while we're in here, it's a good idea to clean up any dust we might find. Note, I'm using a very special brush called an anti-static brush designed to demagnetize and or energize the dust particles, allowing them to more easily be forced off the fan. Be very careful utilizing this brush, especially on components on the motherboard, as it can quite literally knock them off. Remember again the age of this machine. While it is not that old, it is certainly not new either. With most of the dust removed, we'll now take a small Phillips head screwdriver and undo the 3 screws to release the fan itself. We need to do this in order to gain access to the hard drive so it can be pulled out.
There we go, it's out. Good.
I should also point out it's a good idea to have a little plastic dish to store your screws in so you can keep track of them when you need to reassemble the unit later on. With the screws successfully removed from the fan, we can pull the whole fan assembly out and lay it to the sides to expose the necessary screws that we'll need to loosen in order to get the hard drive out. To get the hard drive out of its cradle, we'll utilize a sponger to pry it loose. Be very careful doing this, as you can easily bend the pins if you want to utilize the hard drive later, and or to avoid damaging the receptacle socket, which we will need to utilize in order to install our SSD replacement.
There we go, it finally came out.
Also, don't forget to pull the Kapton tape with the wires clear of the hard drive so you don't risk damaging them in the process of removing it. Hard drive out, we're now going to replace this with an SSD. Again, this is a specific SSD designed to work with the PATA or PATA interface, or a TAPI as it's also known. Please note a SATA interface, type drive used in modern laptops, which is the type of hard drive we're replacing here, would not work as it utilizes a completely different cable and power system. Use caution when inserting the drive into the actual receptacle/socket, as you can easily again bend the pins. With the new SSD now in place, we can now secure it into its position with the stock screws. Please note, I'm only going to utilize 2 screws to hold this SSD in place, as SSDs are far less sensitive to vibration as opposed to hard drives. With the SSD now fully installed, it's time to upgrade the RAM. Again, we'll be using a stick of DDR, not DDR2, not DDR3, but just plain ordinary DDR RAM, PC2700, the total capacity of 1 gigabyte, replacing our original 512 stick that came with the unit. To release the original RAM stick, I simply pull the clasps back away from it. This allows me to simply remove it from the case altogether. To install the replacement 1 gigabyte stick of RAM, we align the cutout of the RAM with the dimple and/or notch located in the actual RAM slot on the board itself, and then gently apply pressure until the clasps close again, locking it in place. Now, with all of our upgrades, cleaning, modifications, etc. done, it's time to start the reassembly process. Again, the last step we did disassembling becomes our first step here to put everything back together. This includes attaching the fan, which is again the sole cooling fan for this particular unit. Drive assembly on top of the motherboard itself, using the edge connector. Replacing the antennas or antenna if you have any of them. Again, these units were available with several different options. Reattaching the motherboard screws. And last but certainly not least, placing the actual case top back on the Mac Mini itself. Now, in my case, I took my time doing this. I didn't want to do it right away until I was absolutely sure OS 9.22 had successfully installed. But first, a post test, or should I say a tone test in this case because it's a Mac. Ah ha ha, that's good. And there is the proof, the question mark Mac, and that makes perfect sense because the drive in there currently does not actually have an operating system on it because we just installed it. So now it is time to pull out the secret sauce to this whole project. This extremely professional-looking CD, by professional-looking I mean amateurish, with the burn of the specially designed image for the Mac Mini G4. This will again allow me to convert this to OS 9.22, allowing me to run all of my vintage games on it and get great performance at the same time, and also not have it take up much space. So let's get going. A quick note on how I ended up finding this image. Do a search for Mac OS 9 Lives and look specifically for the Mac Mini G4 variant of this particular image and go ahead and pull it down. I won't provide a link as it's changing all the time. My advice again, get the most up-to-date one you can find. Nope, correction, it started booting up by itself. That's crazy. Just started working by itself. So now the next question is, will it recognize the solid-state drive I just shoved in there, or will I be in big trouble again and I'll have to take it all apart? Please work, please work. Well, first, it's going to be a while before this thing loads up. It's got to load all the drivers. I should get my light off here. There's no sense in using this. We're done with this right now. And there it is. We see on the side, it recognized the drive, which is an older version of Mac OS 9. I'm going to now get ready to install everything. And with that, I'm in pretty good shape here. Just to initialize this disk, which I will do right now. This is an older version of this
OS 9 lives. I'm just going to go in here and just hit initialize. Does this say initialize it? It's going to warn me that I'm going to override it. Please note when you do initialize a disk on a Mac, you are asking it to basically format it as well as repartition it. Well, essentially that is, I believe this is actually partitioning it. It's going to become untitled now. It should also rename itself to another version of that. There we go. Now it's all set. This mouse is painfully slow. Note on this particular setup, for some reason the mouse is set to the absolute slowest speed. Why? I don't know. I don't know if it's to make sure someone knows what they're doing before they start or something, or well, yes, I'm just guessing there. And again, that's my monitor. Gonna have to quit out of that. There we go again. You have to quit out of the actual program itself in order to continue. And my monitor does not like this resolution it's in right now, so I need to do it quick. Special, I think, is Apple. How do I quit this again? And I'm just gonna do a command here. Apple Q will get you out, and that should close this window. There it goes, Apple Q. And now I can initialize the install. Initiate the install by simply clicking on this here on the top, double clicking it with my period trick mouse, which is slow because I haven't adjusted the settings yet, and just double click the Apple software restore thing, icon thing, and that'll then talk me through it. And all I'm going to do here is just say go ahead and restore by hitting the enter key on the keyboard. I just have to say now continue. I believe that's the continue button. The problem is you can't move that window, so I believe that's the continue button. Yep, it's working. So it should now be done after a little while of working.
After completing the install and restarting the system, voila, I was in macOS 9.2.2. So what can you do with your Mac Mini that has newly been hacked to an old school operating system? Well, you can play a lot of old school games. Most people would go to Duke Nukem and a few other games that were very popular back in the 90s. I'd like to go for the earlier 90s, late 80s section. Let's start with that most addicting of puzzle games, Lemmings. Pretty much the granddaddy of them all. And here's another one you'll remember if you were a kid in the 90s, especially early 90s, Chuck Yeager's Air Combat.
Got him. Let's do a loop then. Use the throttle a little bit more. Turn. There we go. Get in here. Flapping gears. I'm gonna raise my landing gear. I'm landing genius. I finished the mission already. And the final. Nice approach here. Coming on down 300 feet. Oh, this guy's shooting at me, of course, now that I've finished the mission. A little bit further in, and it should be a nice touchdown right there. There we are. Brakes on to stop.
That's good flying.
Yep, that worked.
Here's another beloved old classic, Wolfpack.
Haha.
Here's a game that I had to include, otherwise this wouldn't simply be a retro gaming session, Oregon
Welcome
Trail.
to the Oregon Trail. You're about to begin to the fertile Willamette Valley. You need to decide when to set off on the trail.
Well, I've had a really good time working on this particular Mac Mini. As you see, I've got a few below it. Those are Intel Macs. More on that in a later video. I've enjoyed my retro gaming, etc. But I can't help but wonder, is there something missing here? Let's see. What could I be missing? Oh, and I got it. A rainbow logo. Well, not my best work with this glue overspray. I guess I'll have to try to scrape that off later, but it'll do. Speaking of things that will do it for this particular video. I hope everyone enjoyed it. This is my first time editing on Final Cut Pro, so I'm interested to see what people thought of how the editing job came out, and I know I definitely found advantages and disadvantages with this software. Anyway, as always, if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, give it a thumbs down. Please subscribe and comment, as it will help me greatly, and as always, keep the metal side down.